This is the third in a series on Ralph Miliband's Marxism and Politics. This video covers the first section in Chapter 6, Reform and Revolution. This section covers two types of political strategy, the strategy of social reform and the strategy of Constitutionalist Marxism. I've heard people call Bill Clinton a socialist. I've heard someone on a call-in show ask a leader in DSA about Bill Clinton's opposition to the right to private property. How silly, right? There's a point to this story. When so-called socialist policies are promoted, and these policies do absolutely nothing to change the power dynamic between workers and bosses, when so-called socialist policies are promoted that are really just half measures, and all they do is make the administration of some government program easier for the government to administer, that's when the word socialist becomes a joke, and it stops meaning anything. Marx and Engels had a field day coming up with funny names to call socialists in name only. Conservative socialists, like Chancellor Bismarck. Feudal socialists, like Prime Minister Disraeli. Imperial socialists, like Napoleon III. Imagine what Marx and Engels might have written about National Socialists. These socialists in name only, they don't represent socialism at all. They're enemies of the democratic socialist tradition. But enough about our enemies. What about our friends? Specifically, what about trade unions that happen to not be class struggle unions? Miliband writes, this book is from the 1970s, by the way, that trade unions, however limited their horizons, have seldom been able to concern themselves exclusively with hours, wages, and conditions, but this need not go beyond improvements of various kinds for the working class within the capitalist system, and with no thought of superseding that system. And this trade union consciousness has been and remains an important, and in some instances a dominant, trend inside organized labor under capitalism. Recall Lenin's quote, "The working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness." Miliband continues, in the 20th century, this trend has also come to dominate large, and in some cases the largest, working class parties in capitalist countries. Britain, Germany, and Sweden are obvious instances. Miliband thinks such reforms, as are championed under trade union consciousness, improvements in hours, wages, and conditions, with no intention of moving beyond capitalism, Miliband thinks such reforms are not socialism. He calls them social reforms. To the strategy of social reforms, Miliband opposes two strains of Marxist revolutionary strategy. These are both revolutionary strategies, but Miliband gives the first one the name reformist Marxism, also known as Constitutionalist Marxism. Miliband characterizes the key ideas in this strategy, Constitutionalist Marxism, as being first, that electoral politics is compatible with revolutionary aspirations. It's true, he says, that the reforms were capable of winning within the narrow horizon of what's possible within capitalist democracy, are, quote, at best steps and partial means toward the overthrow of capitalism, end quote. but it's possible to be thoroughly involved in ordinary political life and the pursuit of reform while constantly keeping your eye on the prize and advancing a revolutionary purpose beyond the aims of those who seek just social reform without wanting to overthrow, so to speak, capitalism. Let me be clear. Constitutionalist Marxism, as Miliband defines it, is a revolutionary strategy. It requires the replacement of capitalism by, quote, an altogether different, that is, socialist society, unquote. The idea here is that harm reduction through ordinary electoral politics is compatible with, quote, the simultaneous advancement of a revolutionary purpose, unquote. Whatever you want to call this strategy, reformist Marxism or constitutionalist Marxism, or even revolutionary social democracy, Miliband wants you to know the idea behind it is not that society will gradually and smoothly transition to socialism. He cites Luxemburg as an example of who he means by constitutionalist Marxists. Luxemburg wrote in 1904 that the real way is to emphasize strongly and develop this struggle both within and without Parliament. This includes strengthening the extra-parliamentary action of the proletariat, as well as a certain organization of the parliamentary action of our deputies. Miliband describes constitutionalist Marxism as a politics of conflict with a strong emphasis on electoral success and the hope of achieving majority or at least strong representation. We shouldn't be overly optimistic. The horizon of what's possible under what passes for democracy in the United States can be a very limited horizon. Of course, when Marx and Engels were writing the manifesto in 1848, the horizon of the possible in electoral politics was even more limited. Slavery was not ended just by the 13th Amendment. But, as Miliband says, constitutionalist Marxism, and indeed all Marxism, is a politics of conflict. The conflict ends when we change the conditions that cause the conflict to endure. We're not going to accomplish socialist paradise overnight because the conditions that underlie class conflict are not going to get changed overnight. Eyes on the prize. We want a majority, but you have to start somewhere. Miliband isn't just playing with ideas and asking questions here. He has a right answer in mind. We get a hint of where he's heading early on in chapter 6, and where he's going to land by the end of the chapter. He says, reformism is also compatible, both theoretically and practically, with forms of struggle which, though carried on within the given constitutional framework, are not related to elections and representation. For instance, industrial struggles, strikes, sit-ins, work-ins, demonstrations, marches, campaigns, etc., designed to advance specific or general demands, oppose governmental policies, protest against given measures, and so on. A few points are made about the relationship between constitutionalist Marxism and, for lack of a better word, ordinary politics, by which Miliband means working within the existing political machinery of the state openly. Under ordinary circumstances, Miliband says, Marxist parties are involved in ordinary politics. They vote. They propose legislation. If they have a legislative majority, they pass it. And if they don't, they work toward building one. They do not, under ordinary circumstances, just up and decide to storm the Bastille or hold secret meetings plotting to do so. But even under extraordinary circumstances, say the events of 1968, the French Communist Party neither authorized nor supported the students and workers who spontaneously took to the streets. The many socialist parties with elected representatives in parliaments across Europe are similarly averse to clandestine or unconstitutional action. If it's illegal to be a Marxist in your home country, that's another story. But where Marxists are allowed to exercise political liberty within the system, they do so. Miliband writes, Marx's quarrels with the anarchists in the First International had to do, among other things, with the contempt that many of them had for ordinary politics and their rejection of sustained and disciplined organization by revolutionaries for the purpose of involvement in such politics. The issue of whether or not to participate in electoral politics continues to divide socialists to this day, and it gets a lot more complicated than the Marxists versus anarchists fight that wrecked the First International. But Lenin, for his part, was never hostile to parliamentary participation as such. Miliband says here, either before 1914 or after. Well, what happened in 1914? Germany declared war on Russia, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany voted for Kaiser Wilhelm's war budget. But even that didn't lead Lenin to conclude that parliamentary participation was hopeless. So, given the limits of ordinary politics under a capitalist regime, what's the point in participating? Miliband recalls Marx's notion of permanent revolution, the application of continuous pressure for pushing the process further than the achievement of a bourgeois democratic republic, and creating the conditions for a revolutionary break within the bourgeois democratic regime itself. Citing Lenin, Miliband suggests that the point of socialist participation in electoral politics is to prepare the working class, quote, for a future complete victory, end quote. Which is not to say Miliband thinks it will be easy, although he seems to suggest that Engels did. Miliband writes, Engels appeared to take it for granted, on the contrary, that the party's program need not be diluted in order eventually to appeal to a majority of the German voters, working class and non-working class. But this was, at best, a very dubious assumption. He continues, Engels' perspective also ignored the temptation to which the leaders of mass working class parties, such as the German Social Democratic Party, would be exposed, namely, to see themselves as the custodians of vast organizations whose effectiveness and future prospects must not be put at risk by extreme policies.